The European Union. Is it time to say goodbye? It's been a rough few years for the EU, especially for its legitimacy. And even supporters get why.
Yeah, there are not very tangible benefits on the everyday life.
Moi, je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de personnes qui ne sont pas satisfaites de l'UE parce que, premièrement, on a perdu un peu l'identité nationale.
Hey guys, it's Sana, and this Sunday on AJ Plus, we're going to explore the question of why there is so much drama over the European Union and why Euroskepticism, aka skepticism about the existence of the EU, is on the rise. Let's start with your European Union basics. Today, the EU has 28 member states, and that's still including the UK for now. About 5 other countries are waiting to join the club. And what does being a member of the Union get you? Well, you get to be a part of the world's largest trading bloc, the European single market. That means trade without restrictions among all countries that are within the EU. It also means having the benefits of a powerful unified front when it comes to negotiating trade deals with countries outside of the EU. In fact, within the EU, all movement of goods, services, and people is unrestricted. And that's something that Europeans feel very strongly about.
The most obvious benefit of being a European Union citizen is that we can travel and work wherever we want in the Union.
Alors les avantages, justement, c'est les avantages politiques, économiques. On peut voyager à travers toute l'Europe juste avec sa carte d'identité. Il y a quoi d'autre? Les échanges internationaux. Maintenant, on voit plus d'étrangers venir en France, quand on voit plus de Français aller dans d'autres pays.
So, with all this collaboration happening across the economy, across trade, how does it actually work? Who decides what happens and how? Well, there are 7 EU institutions which include an executive branch, 2 legislative branches, a judicial branch, and a central bank. Each member country directly elects and sends representatives to the European Parliament, and there are a total of 751 MEPs from across Europe. By the way, remember Nigel Farage, the face of Brexit?
The EU's failing, the EU's dying. I hope we've knocked the first brick out of the wall.
Yeah. He's a member of European Parliament. So why all this skepticism about something that sounds kind of solid? Professor John Gillingham thinks it's been flawed from the get-go.
The basic reason for it is the unrepresentative character of European institutions, which don't provide a proper mechanism for public feedback. The European Union is not a democracy or anything like it. The European Union exists in a kind of a political, diplomatic never-never land.
Now, usually when we hear about Euroscepticism, we hear about the xenophobic, anti-immigrant rhetoric that is at the heart of several Eurosceptic political parties and movements. But what are some other criticisms of the EU? Well, take the euro currency, for example. It was introduced in 2002 and it's used across 19 countries. And for a while there, it seemed like it was working. But then the global financial crisis spread to Europe in late 2009. 5 countries that use the currency, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and Cyprus, were unable to pay their government debt and had to be bailed out. And for a while there was even talk of Greece abandoning the currency altogether. And experts argue that this was due to a lack of economic integration. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's like this. You have one currency for 19 different countries, meaning one currency for 19 different economies. Some of those economies are strong, like Germany's, and others are like Greece's.
Il y a des pays plus riches, et il y a des pays moins riches, peut-être on peut dire des pauvres, tu vois. Chaque fois, les pays riches doivent couvrir les pays pauvres.
Not all economies are going to respond to difficult or even good times in the same way. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, EU politicians forced countries like Greece to make deep budget cuts to make them more competitive. That led to big austerity measures, and Greek citizens took to the streets. But some argue that isn't enough, and that in order for the euro to succeed, their economies have to look more alike. That means a more centralized approach. Which brings us to the next critique of the EU, the argument that too much power has been taken away from national governments and given to EU institutions. Critics argue that the EU is calling the shots more than individual governments. Take the European Parliament, for example. Over the years, in an effort to make the EU more democratic and add to its legitimacy, more power has been given to the European Parliament. Today, nearly everything the EU does requires approval from Parliament. And since the EU is involved in as much as half of all legislation in Europe, some say that makes the European Parliament more powerful than most national legislatures. And at the same time, fewer people are interested in EU parliamentary elections. Voter turnout has fallen consistently since 1979. That combination of more power and less voter participation makes some people uncomfortable.
Tout ça, je pense que vu qu'il y a beaucoup trop de nations dans l'Union européenne qui veulent se faire entendre, qui veulent entendre leur propre voix, C'est ça qui cause les problèmes de l'Europe, je pense.
The question of EU expansion, or enlargement as it's awkwardly called, has been hotly debated since its inception. Part of the argument against adding new countries goes back to the issue of economic integration, because the euro is already struggling with 19 different economies. Will adding more even help? But the other part of the argument has to do with the free movement of people within the EU. France barely approved the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and they failed to ratify the European Constitution in 2005. And a big part of the concern in both cases focused on immigration and asylum. Now there's a possibility that majority Muslim Turkey might join the EU, and add to that the refugee crisis, and bam, anti-immigrant sentiments are easily stoked. But Professor Gillingham says that in the majority of countries, it's not hatred or xenophobia, but fear of losing jobs or welfare.
Europeans, whether of the so-called political right, the so-called political left, are profoundly conservative. They're satisfied with their way of life, the benefits of the welfare state, and they don't want them to erode, disappear, or be challenged.
That said, xenophobia has been a huge part of many Eurosceptic movements and groups, which gives Euroskepticism in and of itself a bad name. So where does the EU go from here? Gillingham isn't optimistic.
There's really no hope at all that the European Union will acquire new powers that will strengthen the road that might lead to a genuine federal union along the lines of the United States.
Nevertheless, there's a huge push for reform from both pro and anti-EU groups. The pro-EU French President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged the dysfunction of the EU and ran on a platform of reform. He suggested creating a Eurozone common budget to invest in growth across the bloc. And the EU itself recognizes that it has little choice left but to change. The European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker presented a report that looks at how Europe will change over the next decade and outlines different paths for the EU. It offers 5 scenarios ranging from expanding and centralizing power in EU institutions to refocusing efforts around the single market. The European Commission will decide on a vision for the future of the bloc, and it will be put to a vote at the next European parliamentary election in 2019. In other words, it will be up to EU citizens themselves to decide, and what they decide will determine the future of all Europeans. So the future of the European Union is really kind of up in the air. And I personally am a little worried about what will happen to Eurovision. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and come back next Sunday where we're gonna have another awesome video, I promise.